Welcome back, Story Seekers. It is time for another tale of ancient times. I am Castle, aka the Jerusalem Yeezus, your humble host, and welcome to my home of stories, my little library, if you will. Today, we are venturing further into the fictional realm, mythology, that is the world of Kratos and Atreus in God of War 4. Now, we've just finished our undead foes, so if you haven't seen that yet, I highly recommend going back and checking it out. It is a lot of fun and a lot of good information there to ready you for what is to come. Because now, we're moving into something that is a little bit more vague, but at the same time, more dynamic. And we're going to be talking about three sort of random, not really necessarily related to each other, but we're going to be talking about three different creatures today. First, we will discuss the Vikings. Second, we will discuss the Travelers. And then third, we will discuss the Ancients. Now, these may not seem as though they have anything to do with each other, but that is because they are some of the enemies that don't have much of an origin. They're not really related to anything else in the story. They don't have a villainy type. They are not undead. They are not of satyr magic. They are not of any of the realms. So that is why they are being bunched together today. So let us begin with the first of our fabulous foes, the Viking. Now, there's not a whole lot in the lore of the actual game that tells us what or where the Vikings come from. But for those of us who are a little bit more savvy, we will recognize that the term Viking, or Vikener, is an old term that was used for the original Vikings and how the Viking era got its name. The Vikings were raiders. Vikener was a pirate. They would raid from areas in Iceland, Sweden, and Norway out into neighboring countries, and they would rob and massacre, and they were fierce warriors and mighty, mighty opponents. And what this tells us is that where we are in Midgard might not necessarily be Norway. Now, I know a lot of the areas in the game are styled after geographical landscapes, but what this is telling us is that we may be here prior to the Viking era, and these are the first of these many warriors. And the reason why this is interesting is because in ancient times, when the Vikings first began raiding, they were described as giant, demon-like men, and the Vikings that we see in God of War are very much to that motif. They are giant, demon-like men. So I found that to be very interesting, and I happen to think that we might see more from the Vikings as time goes on. And many of the places that we encounter the Vikings in the game is near water. So it's very interesting, and I'm hoping that when the next game rolls around, we may see more of these mighty warriors begin to develop as we approach what could be an early Ragnarok. Now, moving on to the second of our strange and fabulous enemies, we have the Travelers. The Travelers are garbed like no other creature in the game, no other enemy, no other warrior. They have tall, pointed helmets, rounded. They have tassels that dangle from them. They have flags, and they carry mighty broadswords like this. Massive swords, huge shields. And this is something that is incredibly interesting because their armor is actually styled in the same way that Western European armor was around the time that the Vikings would have started raiding as well. So areas where the Celts, the Gauls, and the British Empire, the Netherlands, all of these areas when they were developing their warrior cultures, a lot of them had similar armor. So, and this armor falls squarely in Celtic and Gaelic areas, which is a nice little crossover for me, because I actually recognized the armor instantly as being very similar to that which Celtic warriors wore later on, and also very similar to Gaulish armor that was developed around the same time. And one of the things that we have discussed in length while talking about my family's history is that we have a combination clan of Norse Vikings that settled in Southern Ireland and my family who were Gaelic warriors. And after a couple hundred years of battling and raiding and pushing each other back, they eventually just became one clan. But what a lot of people don't realize is how common this was. Many great warrior cultures did end up integrating with each other over time. You saw it all throughout Asia for different warrior families there, very common with Genghis Khan and for the Huns. And it also happened the other way around. Because if we look at the shields of a couple of the travelers, the text, the runes on them says unbreakable. And unbreakable was something that would be carved into the chests of the Irish berserkers, which were called Cúlaman. And Cúlaman were very much these giant demon-like figures, and you see sort of a parallel between the Viking and the travelers. They are huge, they're mighty, they're monster-like, but they're still men. But there's this mystique to them, this sort of scariness that makes them feel like they are something slightly more and slightly less than a man at the same time. So what is implied is that these Western European warriors, because there are a few things that you can get from them, trophies that you can get from them, that will say things that are related to Aesir magic and the blessings of the gods, and of course having it written in Norse runes or in Elder Futhark is evidentiary that these travelers have taken on the might of Asgard. They have set themselves amongst the Asgardians. And it is not so much in the sense that because what they have is a trophy. It is a trophy that they carried with them of victory in battle, and it is implied that perhaps they fought some lesser Aesir gods or lesser Aesir warriors and won, and that is where the trophies came from. So that is all very interesting, but I know why you're all here. You are here for the ancients. Now, the ancients are absolutely fascinating because there is lore for these creatures in just about every mythology around the world, but for sake of time, we're just going to stick to the Norse mythology here and what the game's codex says about where these creatures come from. Now, it is said that they are some of the oldest creatures in the whole of the world of Kratos and Atreus, and that they are made from the original essence and body of a great figure in the Norse pantheon, one all too often forgotten to the pages of commonality, and his name is Argormir. Now, you may not recognize him by that name, but I would like for those of you who do not know to actually go and look up the name yourself, and I will put the spelling here so that you can go and wet your whistle, tickle your intellectual pickle with a little bit of research. But I will give you great hints as to who he was. He was the first Jotun. He was the first giant and the only of the giants who was truly monstrous in size. He was the father of all creatures. Now, there is much debate as to where different creatures came from and how Aurgelmir was formed. But the way that it was taught to me and the way that it seems to be brought about in the game, there's a conflict because what is told to Atreus by his mother and what Mimir tells us are two very different things, which is more evidence as to how the game is being written, that not everything we hear and read may necessarily be trustworthy. as the Aesir, Vanir, and all the other different realms probably have their own versions of the stories that they tell amongst themselves. But we'll go with what is likely to be the truth, and that is Argolmir was the first Jotun, the first giant, formed from the ice crystals of Niflheim, meeting the hot, mighty wind from Muspelheim, and the drips formed his body over time. Now that is what is told in the traditional Havamal. Now you have to forgive me for the pronunciation on this this next part because I always get it wrong. It's Gegungan Gaga, I believe is how it's said, and that is the space in between spaces. That is the void off of the Rainbow Bridge. That is where Argolmir was born. And then from his body was born the first of the giants, and from the sweat that came from his body and formed with the ice, we had Bur. And this is part of the creation myth, and that's going to be a whole video on its own. But there is a lot of weight around the myth of this character because it gives us a lot of the story for the motivations behind each individual character throughout the story of God of War. But again, we will have more on that later. Back to the Ancients. The Ancients are the last remaining living remnants of his soul and his essence, formed at the same time that he did, and given new life and sentience after he was killed. They exist to protect the areas that they are near. They are made up of all of the different elements. Now, in the mythologies that I learned as a boy, there were 13 elements, but in the mythologies taught through the Havamal and the Eddas, we know that there are 7 elements. 7 elements. There are more, but we read 7 elements because Asgard and Helheim don't count as elemental realms. But we have 1 element for each of the realms, and each of the ancients is assigned to one of those elements. Now, there is a variation on these ancients. Now, before we move on, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we move on, keep in mind that these creatures are in fact sentient and they are docile. They are guardians of the area they are in, and the only time that they can be provoked to attack in the game is if they are attacked first. And of course, the raw materials of their body make for an excellent armor in the game. But we also have to stop and wonder, what are we taking from the world when we eliminate these ancient creatures? Now, that can be answered very simply by talking about the second type of ancient, the variant of the ancients called Soul Eater. Now, the Soul Eaters were made by the dwarven alchemist Andvari. And Andvari found a way to domesticate the ancients by removing their souls, removing the essence from them, in order to turn them into beasts of burden. And for a while, this worked. But then, they turned on their dwarven masters, murdered them in cold blood, and sucked their souls into the void in them. And it is... Now, there is some grounds for this in the actual mythology, where some ancient golems had their energy removed for source of satyr magic, and they did not kill the beasts, but instead turned them into demons of sorts, and created a sort of mini, and I'm going to butcher the name again, hang on, Ginun Gagap, inside of these creatures. So when they absorbed the soul was denied any afterlife and forced to live inside the ancient until it died, at which point they would still be denied an afterlife, and their body and their soul would be sent to the space in between spaces, forever denied passage into paradise. So that is all I have on this for today, my friends. I thank you for staying till the end and listening to my story. And for those of you of the Secret Society who stay till the very end, I have a little bit of extra for you. I know I was being all mysterious before, but the giant who we're speaking of is also referred to as Ymir, and the very tree of the 9 realms, Yggdrasil, was born from the leg flesh of Ymir. And it's not said Ymir, that's my mispronunciations, it's Emir. Emir was, and it pronounces to, I think, Screaming One or Screams, and he is the father of all life in the 9 realms. And his body, after his death, is what makes up the 9 realms. Or at least makes up the structure, the further structure of Yggdrasil. But Yggdrasil was referred to as a 6-headed son who was born from the leg of Ymir. And the reason why it is 6 and not 9 is because Helheim and Asgard were forged by the Aesir gods, and Vanaheim was forged by the Vanir gods. And to a degree, there's a little bit of mystery around this part about when Jotunheim was formed, if it was formed with the life of Ymir or if it formed sometime later. But it is believed that it formed with the 6-headed child that came from his leg. Now, if you guys would like a whole video on the individual great giants, it'll be some time before I get to it, because it's not going to be a part of this series. But if you would like a full video on all of the great giants, before or after we do the full Norse Pantheon for a different series, let me know in the comments down below. And if you have not already, please smash the like button. I really appreciate it. Oh, you're not going to smash it. Tap it. Save your smashing power for that blood red subscribe button and absolutely annihilate it. Destroy it in battle, and you will know you've won that battle, because the blood will drain from it and it'll become a deathly grey. And then you can ring the victory bell, which resides right next to it, so that all will know of your victory, and you will always know when I upload. That being said, guys, that is the end. Stay bloodthirsty, my friends, and remember, all hail. Alright guys, that is going to be the end of our video on the Vikings, the Travelers, and the Ancients. I hope you did enjoy. And for those of you that have stayed till the end, remember, I'm dropping little tidbits in here that will be asked on the last video in this series. And at that time, I will be giving away a free copy of God of War 4. And last time I said that I'd either do it on PC or on PlayStation 4. What I meant was that PlayStation now has their PC app, because I had said Steam in the last video. I mean, they have their app now, so I can do it either digitally, or if you prefer a disc, I will buy a disc and I will send it to whoever ends up winning that. That being said, if you don't follow me on Instagram and Twitter, that's where I do all my announcements and polls, and I'm about to start something really fun on Twitter. So if you don't follow me there, do. I'm about to start a bunch of new series on TikTok, so if you don't follow me on TikTok yet, please do. I'm completely revamping my content there to do other stuff. I'll still be doing cultural stuff, but I wanted to do some more nerd and entertaining stuff because you guys have been asking for it, and trying to keep up with all the requests. And thank you to my patrons. I don't have my Patreon page up, but Linz, Selena, Katie, and I'll put a list of the names here for everybody who has joined my Patreon and is supporting my podcast. I appreciate you guys very much. If you don't already listen to my podcast, it's Endless Epic. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts, or you can get it a week early on my Patreon page, as well as some of my scripts and notes from my episodes that have information that doesn't necessarily make it into all of the episodes, because I ad-lib a lot of this stuff. So thank you guys so much for joining me. And again, please, if you enjoyed the content, leave a like and subscribe. It helps out a lot. And I'm really stoked for how everything's been growing. And I know I've already said it, but stay bloodthirsty, my friends. And remember, all hail.